From the back alleys of my badly organized memory, I managed to remember a couple of more games that I actually played on the Atari ST back in the early 1990s on the STE I mentioned in the first Atari ST episode of my Nostalgia Trip games. And one of them was arguably the best James Bond game ever, made by Domark. The Spy Who Loved Me. I always wondered about this one because it was nowhere near the most recent Bond movie when the game was made. In fact, it was 13 years old by that time, but Domark were probably under some sort of an obligation after License to Kill that they decided to revisit a random old Bond movie based on what sort of action sequences could be made into a game. For once, they decided to go with a classic Spy Hunter style, at least start the game with that, to give it a familiar touch of what spy games used to be in the early days. There are different sorts of action sequences in the game as well, but it's all somehow shoot-'em-up based, whether it's on the road, underwater, or from some different point of view altogether. Much like all the other Bond movie games, The Spy Who Loved Me actually follows the movie's plotline pretty closely, as far as any game of this age is able to. You start by driving a Lotus Esprit down a narrow road full of hazards, such as cones, pedestrians standing in the middle of the road, oddly placed mines, and of course enemy vehicles. The primary goal of level 1 is to collect as many of the Q coins as possible and make it through the level in one piece. The aforementioned Spy Hunter elements start appearing in the middle of level 1, where you get to turn your Lotus into a speedboat. Level 2 features a Q truck, which you need to drive into to use the Q coins to buy your Lotus some additional gadgets, such as the underwater ability, so you can even access the third level, where you get to do some underwater shooting. Another later level gets you to do some non-moving first-person target shooting, and then you get to do some jet skiing, etc. I played this one a lot more on the Amiga, but I remember playing it first on the Atari STE, and for that reason, The Spy Who Loved Me gets a mention here. Besides, it actually feels better on the Atari ST than it does on the Amiga. I've never really gotten too far in this game, but that's more to do with my lack of focus than the game's difficulty. Despite being a Domark Bond game, The Spy Who Loved Me is one that I can actually recommend. Next we have a classic arcade game from Atari, Tempest. For those few of you who haven't heard of it, it's basically a three-dimensional Space Invaders variant that's played in cylinders and other oddly shaped tunnel-like platforms that you can move around. To be honest, I hadn't actually even heard of this game until Tempest 2000 came along in 1994, and I played it on my first PC in 1996, but I played this game a few times through emulation once I learned about its existence. Sure, the original arcade game is a classic for all the right reasons, but I can't say the ST version was all that well made. I mean, yeah, it's fast enough, and it plays pretty much how it's supposed to, but you can see better animations in the Amstrad and Spectrum versions. Come to think of it, maybe I should do a proper comparison of this game at some point. What I think is a bit odd here is that the original arcade game was made in 1981 and was ported to ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC and the two 8-bit Acorn computers before the first and only 16-bit conversion came along for the ST, even though ports for Atari's earlier 2600, 5200 and even the 8-bit computers were in the works before being cancelled for whatever reason. As you might have noticed, for some reason Tempest was neither ever officially ported to the Commodore computers, so the first home computer port of the original that I got to play was the ST version, because that's what I looked at first. On the other hand, what a waste of time, but then again, it certainly stuck in my mind as something very unexpected. Not recommended, but it is playable. And then we have another driving game, but this is definitely more of a racing game than that Bond game. And it's got a funny title too, Vroom. It's a French game, developed by Dan McRae and published by Lancour in 1991. I first saw this game being played on the Amiga, but I didn't actually play it until much later on. I found out fairly early in the age of emulation that this was an Atari ST original, although Vroom itself is based on a 1986 Sinclair QL game called Vroom with a W, also by Dan McRae. So I saw this version out and ended up preferring this one over the Amiga version. Vroom is an oddity in the genre of racing simulations. in that it's not exactly a simulation in the way most racing simulations are. What it attempted to do was two things. First, give the gamer a sense of speed and nice visuals by not going with the full 3D polygon thing that Geoff Crammond's masterpieces Stunt Car Race and Formula 1 Grand Prix were going with, but rather go with a 2D bitmap and 3D polygon combination, which makes it quicker than anything ever seen before from a first-person point of view in racing games. Second thing was to have analog controls, but because analog racing wheels were not yet a common thing, mouse was made the primary controller in all other modes but the arcade mode. The game also features training and racing modes where you can adjust the number of laps and the transmission type as well as the track you're about to race on. The arcade mode just puts you through every track in the game. There's also a possibility to race between two machines through a link cable, but a later version of Vroom gave you an option to play against another player in the hot seat mode, with the screen divided in half between the two players. Although Vroom was in no way a favorite for racing purists who wanted to have their experience as closely simulated to the real thing as possible, it did give you an experience of speed and fun that many other F1 racing games lacked at the time. Which is probably why FIA gave it an official license later on to rebrand and modify the game for an updated feel, and these games were released as F1 and F1 World Championship Edition on the Sega consoles, Amiga, and the platform of origin, the Atari ST. If that's not an official endorsement and recommendation to try Vroom out, I don't know what is. Here's another one of those games I read about in a magazine but couldn't actually get to try them out until emulation. Brat from Imageworks, 1991.
No way, man!
This one was also released on the Amiga, but I remember trying to find this game online before the turn of the millennium, and for some reason I wasn't able to find the Amiga version of it. Just as well, because the Atari version is the original, and that's what I found and played for a while. Again, it's nothing spectacular, but it was a game that took my interest because of the magazine article, and I remember being intrigued by the idea of playing as a little kid wreaking havoc in any imaginable manner, much like you did in the old 8-bit classic Jack the Nipper. But this is a very different beast. It's an isometric puzzle game that has a time limit of a peculiar kind. The way to move the little brat is to place arrows and other icons in his pathway, which is difficult enough as it is because you use the mouse to even select the icons from the icon bar. The screen moves downwards constantly at a surprisingly quick rate, unless you place a triangular halt icon on the brat's path, which halts the screen for about 9 seconds, or a turnaround icon which makes the screen go backwards for a little while before turning forwards again, but that one isn't even available at first. You need to use dynamites to blow up stone blockages, bridge blocks to link up separated platforms, and all sorts of other icons to deal with all sorts of other things that I haven't even found out yet. One of the biggest problems about this game is that there is no documentation of it online, so the only way to get started is to view the Toy Town demo, which shows a very hectic demonstration of what you can do with some of the things that they have managed to cram into the demo. Of course, this doesn't actually help all that much with a couple of things even in the first actual level, but that's where you need to do like they used to do in the olden days and use your head. Brat is not one of the most comfortable games to get to grips with, but it is an addictive little nuisance. Playability-wise, the Amiga version doesn't really differ in any notable way, but the soundtrack by the late Anthony Lees is really the reason why I've stuck with the ST version.
Aw, you blew it, man!
I'm not sure if the last game of today was actually ever considered a particularly good game, but it's certainly a very peculiar one. Goldrunner from Microdeal was released in 1987, and it takes much of its inspiration from the C64 classic Uridium from 1986. Instead of moving right and left, you can go up and down in this shooter, and the idea is to shoot enough of land targets to drain the energy from the area and open up a portal to the next level. Easier said than done, because the game is ridiculously fast at its quickest, and the way the flying enemies shoot at you can make dodging the bullets next to impossible at times. Also, similarly to Iridium, there are unbreakable obstacles in all levels, so you need to memorize the levels in that regard. The most notable way Goldrunner differs from Iridium is the length of all the levels as well as their circular form. You can loop through the map, whichever way you choose to fly towards. Also, unlike Iridium's Manta Fighter, you can't actually spin the Goldrunner ship in such a way as to fit through narrower passages, but then there are no such passages in this game. Arguably the best thing about Goldrunner is its soundtrack by Rob Hubbard, and the vast amount of speech samples, which can get a bit irritating after a while. What makes Goldrunner particularly peculiar is its primary control method, as you're supposed to play it with a mouse. Using an old-fashioned ball mouse isn't really the best option, and even with a more modern laser mouse, controlling your ship with one is just too jittery to feel completely playable. But because the game uses two fire buttons, one for firing and one for a speed boost, a regular single-button joystick is not exactly the most optimal choice either, although it is an option. Goldrunner is another game I first came across in a magazine which had given it something like a 50% or 60% score, which I completely understand. But at least I got to play this one on the Atari ST I've mentioned a few times now, so there's some proper nostalgia involved there.